What is magic?
Many, many things.
Is it a coincidence that Merlin lived for 372 years and that's the exact number of pages in your new book?
It carries from my mind, which then enters into your mind. I watched your video about the Piper of Windy Heart. Then you gave, as it were, your particular astronomical take on it. Merlin and Arthur turn into owls and then fly into a stargazing tower. And then Merlin shows Arthur the night sky. The lands still hold the tale of old, like hidden treasure, buried gold.
Malcolm Guite is a celebrated poet, Cambridge scholar, and Anglican priest. Known for 5 poetry collections, we explore his recent 4-part epic, Merlin's Isle, an Arthuriad. Its first installment, Galahad and the Grail, showcases Malcolm's profound storytelling skills, brilliantly bridging faith, theology, and the arts to retell the quest to heal the Fisher King and achieve the Holy Grail.
I'm in my study in a little house in North Norfolk. I'm involved in making a film about St. Columba. So I've just come back from Donegal, and then at the end of the month, I'll be in Iona. And I'm half Scots, I should say. That's one of the reasons why I said yes to this. So my mother and all her folk on all sides are Scots. And the poetry side of me very much comes from my mother and my grandmother. My grandmother was a published poet in Glasgow, and she, among other things, published an amazing book called A Legendary of St. Mungo, which tells the stories of both Mungo and Columba. And I'm called Malcolm, i.e. disciple of Columba, for that reason. He's a bridge figure between the pre-Christian and the Christian dispensation, and one has to take both of those. I mean, both of them so seriously. So the tradition is that Columba trained as a bard with the last of the Irish bards. So the bardic wisdom is clearly the memory of the clan and the folk, and he's the grandson, isn't he, or the great-grandson of Niall of the 9 Hostages. So, and in some versions of the story, I mean, he has various encounters with the she-wolf, but there's a character called Mongan whom in one version of the story Columba converts, as it were, and he becomes a hermit. But he's obviously able to see both realms, and he has 2 names, of course. So he's called Crinthlan the Fox, or the Knowing One, but then he takes the name Colum Keeler, the Dove of the Church. Anyway, I've had he's a significant figure to me, and I had a kind of epiphany in Glen Colum Keeler when I visited it when I was 19, back in 1977. And I wrote some poetry and some other things about that. And some of these American filmmakers found it, and they had this idea that I should go back, like nearly 50 years later, and tell the story of Columba, but I'm telling it with new poetry. But I'm also quoting my grandmother's poetry.
This is fantastic. And have you filmed this already, or is it something you're about to do? You've just done?
No, we've already begun the filming. We did a couple of days filming here with me in my study and my writing hut and in the woods where I walk every day. And then for the last 2 days, we've filmed in Donegal. We were trying to get to see the Cathac, but the Royal Irish Academy wouldn't let us do it. But we did a bit of filming in Dublin and mainly in Donegal. And then they're going to meet me in Oban. We're going to go out to Iona. We're actually going to sail out to Iona in a sailing boat.
Fantastic.
So they hope to finish all the filming by sort of beginning of July, and then it'll probably be ages they'll be doing, take it into post and all kinds of editing. But it's not going to be a massive, it's going to be a fairly short film, but they're doing it very professionally. So I'll be interested to see the results.
You mentioned there about the film being short. I've watched filmmaking over the last 30 years where audiences loved a 5-minute slow burn, half an hour set in the narrative and the plot and the characters. The modern audience likes to see a 15-minute short film, start, middle, and end. Give it to me.
I mean, the official subject of our conversation here, of course, is the Arthurian epic I've embarked on, the first volume of which is now out. And that is contra mundum. That I'm saying, no, I don't think we need shorts. I don't think we need to diminish our attention span. I think we need precisely the opposite. We need the great, long, grand narrative again. We mustn't, the postmodernists have told us to be suspicious of what they call the meta-narrative, but if we don't have a narrative, we perish. So
yes, indeed.
I'm doing. I was really pleased when it was reviewed by the Times. This book, the reviewer said it's an he said it's a miracle, but he said it's an antidote to AI slop. So,
Perfect.
I'll go with that.
If we assume that the oldest Welsh narratives are correct and that Merlin was born around 400 AD, he was an advisor to Vortigern, the fatherless son, and then he became a Christian and died sometime around 632 AD, as the narrative tells us beside the Poseel burn. Is it a coincidence that Merlin lived for 372 years and that's the exact number of pages in your new book?
It's not. That is a coincidence.
Is it really? Let's not say coincidence. Let's say a cosmic irony.
Oh yeah, there are a series of. In the entire writing of this book, there's been a whole series of little confirmations of the most extraordinary sort. From the almost absurd to the kind of the delightful. For example, when I was working on, obviously I really soaked myself in the very many and many very different medieval sources. But I was reading mainly Mallory and then trying to get behind. But I realized at some point I needed to read the Quest de Saint Grail, which is, anonymous, probably written in Cistercian thing, but it's the most kind of consciously sacramental take on the Grail story. So I thought I need this book. And I was sat in my local pub, the White Swan, and they have a bit of the corner where I tend to sit, where they've got a lot of tatty old paperbacks that people just leave there, which are mostly airport novels and bonkbusters and sort of sex and shopping, right? And I'm sitting there thinking, I look up, and between two of these kind of bonkbusters is a slender volume, and it's what I need. It's the English translation of the Quest de Saint Grail. I've absolutely no idea why it's there. So I go up to the landlady and say, can I borrow this? And she said, you can have it. Nobody's going to read that, and there it was, like in the most unlikely place at the point where I needed it. So I thought, well, I'll take this as a little confirmation. But there are all kinds of things. We've made a film about the making of this poem, and it involved a small team following me and the illustrator through all kinds of beautiful bits of woodland. And obviously we went to Glastonbury and we went up the Tor and we went to Tintagel and Rosemary Pool and so on. So, and later on we'll go to Wales and Ireland. But we were going to film this bit where I've got a thing which comes in the next volume called Merlin and the Oak Tree, where they come into an oak grove and Merlin explains to Arthur that this was sacred to the Druids and so on. And then he gives Arthur the power to kind of kive, as they would say, as the Scots would say, to kind of mentally twin with the tree and to see life from the oak tree's point of view. So they wanted me to read this. And the other three, the three sacred trees, unsurprisingly, in the book are oak and ash and thorn. And so we needed somewhere there would be oak and ash and thorn together. And they forgot to bring the little camping stool up for me to sit down on near an oak tree to read this passage. And I just said with confidence, don't worry, there will be, in the poem, there's a fallen oak, and Merlin sits on that. And I said, look, the trees have already read the poem. There will be a fallen oak in the right place. Trust. And it was absolutely there. And of course, I wasn't freaked out because I kind of started to expect this kind of thing. But the camera crew were totally freaked out by that.
What is magic? What does that word mean to you?
Well, many, many things.
Uh-huh.
Let me take two related words, which are less ambiguous or perhaps less ambiguous than magic. So spell and enchantment. For me, it's no coincidence that the word spell both means the magical utterance that transfigures or transforms things. And it also means that thing I found so difficult at school, which is putting the letters in the right order to spell a word. Just like the word grammar is related to the word grammary, which is another word for magic. So there is something intrinsically magic about language, about the capacity of words to connect with things, and the extraordinary fluid thing whereby something that I see no longer remains islanded in the concavity of my skull, but becomes something that you see too. I can make you see it. So I think there's a primary magic in language, and I think that's to do with spell, and it's to do with enchantment, which is the other word. And the word chant is inside the word enchantment. So I am in some sense trying to cast a spell or to re-enchant. I mean, I'm slightly dubious about, there's a lot of discourse now going right back to Max Weber about that we've disenchanted the world, or we live in a disenchanted world in the imminent frame. And lots of people, myself including, might be involved broadly in a project of re-enchantment. Now, I have slight issues with that language in that I don't think it's in our power to re-enchant the world. What I think is the case is that the world is already enchanted and always has been enchanted. What we have to do is, we're the ones who are disenchanted, so we have to undisenchant ourselves, and that requires a certain kind of utterance, a kind of chanting, because chant is an enchantment. So the reason why I wrote this book in poetic form, in a strong, using an oral tradition, the ballad form, I learned the rhythms and the cadences of the ballads from my mother, who sang Scots ballads and then presented me with, I have the original edition in 3 volumes of Scott's Border Minstrelsy. So I know all those ballads. So that's something I want to say about chant. Now, to go back to the word magic is a bit clouded or obscured because of the different senses of it. There's a kind of good kind of magic, which is but obviously magic has been used, and there are long traditions about the sorcerer, the necromancer, the person who is using magic manipulatively, the person who is able to curse, for example. And the Irish poets, for example, brilliant as they were at remembering, were also incredibly good at cursing. And, you didn't want to be cursed by those guys because it stuck. So there's a shadow side to it. Now, I think, there's a very good book by Charles Williams, who was deeply seen in all these things and was part of the Order of Golden Dawn and things. He wrote a book called Witchcraft, in which he says, actually, if you want to know the difference between white magic and black magic, or high Renaissance magia and, kind of darker occult things, it's not in the words or the formulae or even necessarily the context. It's entirely in the intention of the person who utters it. So an abusive and manipulative person will use everything at their disposal to be abusive and manipulative. Lots of people use the internet for that purpose. And before that, some people may have used magic for that purpose, and one has to be rightly wary of that. But I think the redemptive thing about magic is that magic connects us immediately with a sense of awe and amazement and wonder. And that ought to be the natural response to the sheer magic of being here. The world, consciousness is essentially magical. The world is essentially magical. And one of the problems we have is that we've pretended for 200 or 300 years that it's essentially mechanical. And it's not mechanical. There is such a thing as cause and effect, and Newton is perfectly right to say physically that every action produces an equal and opposite reaction, and our watches and clocks and pendula depend on that. But that's only one level of explanation. Aristotle reckons that there's 4 causes for everything: first cause, formal cause, efficient cause, and final cause. An efficient cause is about how stuff works physically. And that the entirety of modern science is completely obsessed with efficient cause, and doesn't even dare anymore to ask what is the first cause of all this, or what's it all for, or what gives it its mysterious form. So we know a huge amount more than our ancestors did about how to make computers and fridges, but the trade-off is that there's a huge amount that we no longer know, and because we no longer know it, we can't even see it.
And don't you see this dissolution of magic, resulting in the increasing mental health issues that our younger generations are suffering.
Oh, well,
No
yeah.
longer, no longer do they have this soothing enchantment of parents and aunties and uncles. They're getting it from artificial intelligent voices telling them stories on cartoons, and that severance between
The problem with those stories is they have no inside. They're simulacra. They're not actually. There's not one soul communicating to another soul. Now, having said all that, I do, I do think that we want to re-enchant and we want to reawake, but the stories, the old stories we want to return to, are also full of caution about the possibility of people selling their soul to the devil, or about the possibility of real inward nightmarish corruption. So I'm slightly wary particularly when I'm talking to the vulnerable young, about at least making them aware that there are perils to be avoided.
So far as the perils, can I ask you, what did you have to destroy in Tennyson and Mallory to make sure that your work wasn't literary nostalgia?
I'm not entirely persuaded by the old mantra that you have to destroy to create. But obviously there are things that you have to be aware of that you want to do differently, because you are speaking to a different age. So the most obvious thing I'm a great admirer of Tennyson as a poet, and particularly his ear. He has the most perfect ear, I think, for the sound of English. Nobody does it better. Whether it's, the murmur of innumerable bees in immemorial elms. Or something even more stark, like break, break, break on thy cold grey stones, O sea, and would that my heart could utter the thoughts that arise in me. So he's perfect. He's note perfect as an English poet. But obviously he's writing at the high Victorian period in the midst of empire. And for him, the matter of Britain, the Arthurian stories, he wanted to retell them really for the fashioning of the perfect gentleman, the kind of person who could then go out and run the empire. And so he's more interested in the Round Table than the Grail. He's seeking first this kingdom rather than the kingdom of heaven. And so he regards the Grail. He only has one book of the 12 books on the Grail. And it's kind of almost literally a will o' the wisp. People are going off and, eventually Galahad has some kind of experience. But for the rest of them, it's just a waste of time. And Tennyson laments that it ends up, weakening the fellowship of the Round Table, which is what he's really interested in.
Yeah.
Now, I think Tennyson is completely wrong about that. And I think he has to distort his medieval sources in order to do his kind of civil political program. And the person who really nails why he's so wrong and gives chapter and verse for it is Charles Williams, the great friend of C.S. Lewis and author, and I suppose in his own way quasi-magician. But anyway, Williams, after he wrote his brilliant book, The Figure of Beatrice, which was his appreciation of Dante, he was working on a book called The Figure of Arthur, and he died before he finished it. He died tragically and suddenly just after the Second World War. And his friend, and I think it's fair to say disciple, C.S. Lewis, as part of the way as dealing with the distress, he published, and it's only ever been in one edition. It's an incredibly rare book, but I have it. He published a book called Arthurian Torso, which was everything that Williams had written up to the point that he died of The Figure of Arthur, a general survey of the whole matter of Britain. And then, Williams published two collections of Arthurian poetry, one called Taliesin through Logres, and the other In the Region of the Summer Stars. And he's Welsh, of course, Williams, so he's kind of got the heritage that he needs for this. But so what Lewis did in Arthurian Torso, and the word torso was important. This is a fragment, not a full thing. He published all that Williams had written on the Arthurian thing, and then he published his own, Lewis's interpretation of Williams's Arthurian poetry. So I read that, and it was like a revelation. I suddenly realized how Tennyson had rearranged and manipulated and changed the emphases. And it made me want to go back and read the earlier things. And basically, Williams' thesis is that Camelot exists for the Grail, not the Grail for Camelot. The real tragedy that is seen is that something so perfect was forming, and all the stars were, as it were, quite literally aligned, that if this thing had worked, the appearance of the Grail in the midst of Camelot, no longer in Castle Carbonac, no longer in some hallow that nobody can get to. For a moment it appears, and then it disappears, and then the knights have to go off and quest for it. That this is a moment that might have been the Parousia. It might have been, in a sense, almost the second coming. It might have initiated the complete transfiguration. But it doesn't happen. That's part of the tragedy. But nevertheless, the memory of it is sustained, and the Grail continues to be the thing that. So whereas Tennyson thought that the Grail was a kind of side quest, which is a bit of a distraction, which is, of course, the way modernism has come more and more to regard religion, all religion, but the spiritual. I mean, I'm a Christian. I should say this from the outset. I'm a thoroughgoing, full-on mystic Trinitarian Christian. I think the Christ event was the turning point of the cosmos. But I recognize that my view is effectively marginalized, and that people look on you as like, why do you still believe these fairy tales? I'm quite happy because I also believe the fairy tales. So I think the Christian vision arose in an enchanted world and makes sense of an enchanted world. And in some sense, it'll only make sense to most people if the world is re-enchanted.
On that note, can I ask you some questions about your own personal beliefs? I think that's the most important part of this. Yeah, sure. So you say a Trinitarian Christian. Could you illustrate that? What exactly do you mean by a Trinitarian Christian? Because you never said Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, Presbyterian. Which bracket would you put yourself in, or are you not in a bracket?
Well, I mean, I don't think those denominations are ultimately real or important, but as it happens, I'm ordained. I'm a priest in the Church of England. So the Church of England is a kind of via media between Catholic and Protestant. It has lots of Catholic elements, but it's reformed. I also have many friends and do a lot of reading from within the Orthodox tradition. I'm fortunate to have some Greek as well as some Latin, and I read the Greek fathers, the Cappadocians, people like Gregory of Nyssa, as well as the Latin fathers, people like Augustine or Tertullian. So I draw most of my grounding theologically is pre-modern, basically. Though the people within, there are some 17th century and 1 or 2 90s. I mean, the poet George Herbert's incredibly important for me. So is the poet Jerry Manley Hopkins. Poet Coleridge is important. But anyway, to go back to what I mean by Trinitarian, I mean, you can say an outer definition like, God is three and God is one or whatever, but these are abstractions. My view is that the revelation, if you like, that God is paradoxically 3 persons and yet one God, really arises from people's actual encounter with Christ, both before and after his resurrection. That he spoke, people recognized the God in him clearly, and they called him Lord. But he spoke continually of his Father, and call no man good, only the Father is good. He's constantly, he's in this intimate relationship with God the Father, and yet they came to see him as eternally begotten. And then he breathes, after the resurrection, he breathes on the disciples and says, receive the Holy Spirit. Then you get the big Pentecost thing. Now, what's actually happening there archetypally is, this is all told in John's Gospel, which is definitely the mystical and poetic Gospel. And it's almost always the favorite of the Celtic saints, or even the early sects. Cuthbert, spent the last weeks of his life just listening to John's Gospel. So it's a kind of chiasmus almost on the New Testament, is on the Genesis. So in Genesis, you have obviously the word that speaks the world into being. You have the Spirit of God moving upon the face of the deep. But then you have this really intimate moment where he makes the person out of the earth. And in the poetic language of Genesis, he kind of stoops down and breathes into them. And of course, in Hebrew, ruach means breath. It means wind, spirit, just as the same word pneuma does that. So something of a new creation is starting to happen when the risen Jesus breathes on them, and then the Spirit comes at Pentecost. Galahad is totally associated with Pentecost in all things. There are tons of kind. So I think these are ways of knowing God, that you can think of the utterly transcendent Father. You can think of the God who is as human as you are in Christ. And then you can think of this invisible wind that blows everywhere. So, I mean, a lot of our problem is not knowing the ancient languages, it's a problem of translation. So, for example, in the famous passage in John where Jesus and Nicodemus are talking, the way it's usually translated, like the way it's translated in the Authorized Version, he says, the wind bloweth where it listeth. Ye hear the sound thereof. Ye know not whence it cometh or whither it goeth. So it is with everyone who is born of the Spirit. Now, these translators in a modern world that divides the spiritual and the physical from each other and has this Cartesian, they had to decide, in a committee, when is Jesus being spiritual and when is he being merely meteorological? Like, when's he talking about wind and when's he talking about the Spirit? And they made their choice, but it's a completely false dilemma. So you could equally translate that passage. The Spirit blows wherever it wills, and you hear the sound of it. You don't know where the Spirit comes from, and you don't know where it's going. And so it is for all of us who are born before the wind. And the very fact that we have to make a choice, literally, we had to invent two different words, inspiration and respiration. And one of them is just this dull material thing, and the other is this inspired thing. But for the ancient worldview, these two things are one.
This is great. I have a question. It's a personal question. Nothing to do with your book. I need to get your take on this. I listen to a lot of Orthodox apologists online, and they do formal debates with atheists, with Muslims. And one of the things I stumble on is this. The Orthodox apologist is quick to refer to the Logos, they ground their logic in God in its widest term.
Logos
They
is
ground
word,
logic in God. Yeah, so let me ask you this. If logic is grounded in God or in the Bible, and A equals A, how can Jesus be Jesus the Son at the same time as God the Father?
Yeah. Well,
Isn't that contrary logic? I'd love your opinion or an answer to that.
The problem there is thinking that the word logos is the root only of logic. It is true that the word logic is related to the word logos, but the word logos, which we translate feebly as word, so opening of John's Gospel in Greek, en arche en hologos. In the beginning was the word, en arche en hologos, hologos en pros ton theon. The word was with God, and then the word was God. Now, logos doesn't just mean where the ologies and the logics come from. It means utterance itself. And obviously, by beginning his gospel with the words in the beginning, John is riffing on Genesis. So in the beginning, when God creates the heavens and the earth, he doesn't have to find some stuff and start fiddling with it. There's nothing there. So what does he do? He speaks. He says, let there be light. And there was light. So he utters things into being. And of course, the word utter is cognate with the word outer. Uttering is making the inner outer. I mean, the central role of the arts and imagination is to make the inner outer and the outer inner. Coleridge says that's the essence of genius of the fine arts. So when I say everything comes from the Logos and we're all known in the Logos, I don't mean by that everything has a logical explanation. Logic is just one of the very remote branches of the Logos. What I mean is everything has meaning. Everything is spoken. The point about a word, like the two things you need to know about a word, obviously, is it has a certain physical substance. It has a shape on a page. It has a sound in the air. It represents certain waves. It has to be spoken physically. But at the same time, the same word can exist mentally without being spoken at all. So St. Augustine uses this as the example. He says, I can have the idea of love in my head, and it really is love. But nobody will know about it. And certainly the person I love won't know about it if I don't say. But I can speak the word love. Now, if I speak the word love becomes physical. It enters time. It has a beginning. It's obviously a bit easier in Latin because it's amor. So at least you've got two syllables to play with. And it has a certain length of time, and then it fades away. But miraculously, when I speak the word into time and space and shape, and it has a physicality, it doesn't lose its meaning. It carries from my mind the eternal meaning it always had, totally embodied in this word, which then enters into your mind
as an utterance.
And it has to be an utterance. So the point is, John, the word was made flesh and dwelt among us. So if I say logos is the source of everything, what I mean is everything in the world, all the phenomena, all the things, every stone, every insect, everything that has weight and dimension and duration and space is more than just its weight and dimension and duration and space. Just as a word is more than its weight and duration and space and its oscillations in the air. It is itself, but it also carries a meaning from beyond itself. So to say that everything springs from the logos is another way of saying that the cosmos is drenched with meaning. And our central problem of modernism, the science, not saying the science isn't good in itself. I'm just saying it doesn't answer. So it would be like this. This is the way Coleridge explains it. I could write a poem, right? And I could give it to you on a piece of paper. And you could say, wow, I got to find out about this. And you could do a chemical analysis of the paper. You might even You might even find out which trees were crushed to make the paper. Fantastic. Take you about a year or so. Then you could notice the ink and, analyze the ink. You could notice the geometrical shapes of the letters and do geometry on them. You could notice certain of them recurred, and you could do a statistical analysis. And you could work for 2 years on that. And every single thing you found out would be factually and actually the case. And you would still have no bloody idea what it actually was, even though you knew all these facts about it. If I then walked into the room and said, oh, by the way, it's a poem, and read it to you, you say, oh my God, it's a poem. It means something. Now, that wouldn't in any way diminish or take away all that statistical research you did about the physicality of the poem, but it would give it an entirely new dimension. So, and in fact, some of the stuff you did scientifically might be quite useful. Like if you'd notice certain letters recurring, that would help you to understand the way rhyme and meter at alliteration worked in the poem. So I'm not against our finding out interesting things about the physicality of the world we find ourselves in. But I think we've all been robbed. It's an appalling, we don't know what it means. And for that, I would say, obviously as a Christian, I think the Christian faith and the deepest levels of it give you a huge amount to go on about what it means. But I think almost all the older ways of thinking give you something to go on about what it means. That's why Columba is so interesting, because he mediates between two ways of understanding what things mean. And, I'm very interested. People talk a lot. You see people on the web talking about the crisis of meaning.
Yes.
Owen Barfield said, how is it that the more we're able to understand about the minutiae of things, the less of the world, the less able we are to find any meaning in it.
Let's take this right back round to your book, bringing into account everything you've just said about your personal beliefs, about the intrinsic moral lessons embedded within Christianity. What do the Grail romances, the story of Galahad, the story of the Grail, what do they offer a modern reader today? What's underlying these so often fantasized narratives about Merlin the magician? What's in there for the modern audience?
Okay, so a key image, at the climax of the Grail story in any version that you read of it, certainly any earlier version, is the unveiling of the Grail. When it first appears, it's covered in this cloth of samite white. So the idea of unveiling, which of course is what the word apocalypse means, lifting of a veil, is central. And what that's saying is you're seeing something, but you're not seeing the inner heart of things. You're only seeing the outsides. Now, let's find a way of lifting the veil and seeing into the heart of things. And the climax of my book is, it's called The Achievement of the Grail, the lifting of the veil. But right at the beginning of the poem, I have a little prelude in which I kind of set this out, and I kind of given my marching orders by the muse. I've wanted to tell this story myself since my Scots mother told it to me in just the most completely enchanting way when I was a little kid. And she gave me the real deal. I didn't get some flattened Disney version of it. I got it in the full mystery. So as I wrote this poem, which is the poet, the muse telling me to write the poem, I didn't plan this, but the image of lifting a veil and revealing something just came up. So I mean, if you've got a moment, I'll just read you some verses of this. This is
I would love you to, please, in your own time.
so you'll see immediately the way I'm riffing on the ballads that you and I probably both know. Take Up the Tale, it's called. As I walked out one morning, all in the soft, fine rain, it seemed as though a silver veil was shining over hill and vale, as though some lovely, long-lost spell had made all new again. And through that shimmer in the air, I seemed to hear a sound, as though a distant horn were blown in some lost land that I had known, that seemed to speak from tree and stone and echo all around. And with the music came these words, "Poet, take up the tale. Take up the tale this land still keeps. In earth and water magic sleeps. The dryad sighs, the naiad weeps. But you can lift the veil. From where the waves wash Cornwall's caves out to the White Horse Vale, the lands still hold the tale of old, like hidden treasure, buried gold. Once more the story must be told. Poet, take up the tale." And I go through a list of some of the things that are in the tale, and then I say this, and this takes us to where we are. Yea, listen well before you start. Be still ere you begin. See through the surface round about, the noise, the rush, the fear, the doubt. Though modern Britain lies without, fair Logres lives within. You may yet walk through Merlin's isle, by oak and ash and thorn. The ancient hills do not forget, and you might wake their wisdom yet. Who knows what wonders might be met on this midsummer morn? So I have taken up the tale to tell it full and free, the tale that makes my heart rejoice. I tell it, for I have no choice. I tell it till another voice takes up the tale from me.
Who taught you how to speak? Listen, these aren't just words on a page. There is, to say 3 dimensions to that poem is to put it down. The way you speak it, the way you tell it, the way you soften the edges of the words and spike the others, I think it's a masterful piece. Thanks for reading that out.
Thank
Really
you. Yeah.
welcome.
I
It's
think
so hypnotic.
it's meant to be. I mean, I am trying to. It was my mother who taught me these things. I mean, not consciously. She didn't say this is how to do something. It was just the way she was. So yes, she would. I mean, it's not like she sat me down in a corner and said, "This is poetry. It's good for you. You've got to have 10 minutes before playtime." I mean, she would just. We would be. I'm giving an example. I was born in Nigeria. I was brought up in Africa, but every year we went back to England. My dad to do his research, and my mother wouldn't fly, so we went by sea. So I can remember being at sea, and I would be on board ship with my mother, and she'd say, "Oh, the sun's going to set. You know, I'll let you stay up, or I'll wake you up so that you can come and see the sunset over the sea." So I'd be sat. You know, I'm 5 or 6, right? My mother, who was very short, she's quite, standing beside me, with her arm around me, and I'd look at the sunset, and my mother would suddenly say, "Out beyond the sunset, could I but find the way, is a sleepy blue laguna that widens to a bay, and there's the blessed city, or so the sailors say, the golden city of St. Mary." You know, I mean,
It's Malcolm. I have a 3.5-year-old son, and when he asks me sometimes to play football, I'm in my 50s. I sometimes come up with a little excuse why not. If he asks me to go and see the chickens, sometimes I come up with an excuse as to why not. But when he says, "Pappy, tell me a story," I never come up with an excuse, because story is the rudiments of everything.
I watched your video about the Piper of Windy Har, and which is very like the Thomas Wright, and I thought you told the story very well. And what you did there, I mean, you then said, "Look, here's how it's true psychologically." Then you gave, as it were, your particular astronomical take on it. The point is that the story is inexhaustible. It's all about that, but it's about a whole lot more as well. And the story, I mean, basically, just as all the words we use are older and wiser than we are, the stories know things.
The first time I read about the Fairy Queen in a velvet green dress under the light of the full moon, I was years dreaming, and that's coming into my imagination and out. I had never heard or seen something so beautiful.
Yeah.
And my imagery of the Fairy Queen impregnates every word I say about her. Even now, when I'm describing it to you, words come easy because it is such a powerful archetype of
It is.
British mythology, if you like.
And my first inkling of that was my mother reciting to me Thomas the Rhymer. So, you know, true Thomas lay on Huntley bank, and he espied a lady gaily. You know, a lady that was brisk and bold, come riding o'er the ferny brae. Her skirt was of the grass green silk, her mantle of the velvet fine. At ilka tetter a horse's mane hung 50 silver bells and 9. You know, and again, what? And then there's a really delicate bit where Thomas thinks it's Our Lady. She for a moment thinks, and she says, "Oh no, I'm not heaven's queen. Like, I'll give that to, but I am the queen of," to say, "I am the queen of fair elf land, where you and I this night mun gay." You know, that's, you know, you've got to change your plans. That's, you know. And, you know, I quote that actually in the book. There's a bit where a knight called Melias meets an elven knight, and he doesn't, like, he totally screws up. He doesn't have the measure of it. He makes the mistake of eating fairy food when he shouldn't have done, and he breaks all the taboos. So he's in deep trouble. But later on, so Galahad knows how to handle that guy, and they have a much more courteous exchange because he's a link between the sacral and the fairy. So, but I have him directly quote the line, you know, "See not the yon bon." There's the road to heaven and there's the road to hell, but then there's this bonny road that lies across the ferny brae. That is the road to fair elfland, where ye and I this night mun gay. You know, and that's straight from my mother. But my mother has it from my grandmother. You know, my grandmother was a poet. I mean, and but also my grandfather and my grandmother together believed really strongly that you shouldn't ever have like readers with graded vocabularies for kids. You shouldn't have the thing like, "Oh, they won't know that word, so don't use it." I mean, how are they ever supposed to know that word if you don't use it?
Absolutely.
So they believe that children should have the best read to them from the earliest ages. I mean, literally in the cradle. My mother had Shakespeare and Milton read to her in the cradle, and she thought it worked for. So I had Shakespeare and Milton read to me in the cradle. Now, I'm not saying I mean, I had hardly language myself, but these sounds were all going into me. And I think there was also, therefore, a quality of recognition when I came to the great moment.
A word has a sound, but the overarching rhythm of a story, the way a story is told, has a sound. Now that goes into a child whether they understand what you're saying or not.
Oh,
My son
totally.
speaks Spanish and English. Now, you said the word earlier. Do you know he very seldom uses the word love? What he says all the time is the word mi amor. He defaults to the Latin amor because it has more sonic significance.
Yeah, it's absolutely. And
it means more inside when he's.
And of course, the English language is precisely polyglot. It is what it is. It's as rich as it is. So we can use the word amorous, which is a very beautiful word. Even though we don't use the word amor, we have the word amorous, which is lovely. And so we have at our disposal within English itself. We have bits of Gaelic, we have Latin, we have French, we have a load of Scandinavian. I mean, the days of the week. So all these are available to us, and that's one of the reasons why we can do extraordinary things. So because the French were the overlords, you know, words with French derivation tend to sound a bit posher, as do Latinate words, whereas Anglo-Saxon words kind of cut clean to the punch and are, tend to be monosyllable. So, but the great writers move between them in a powerful way. So, for example, when Lady Macbeth is washing her hands of blood and she's saying, "Oh God, this is a cosmic sin," she said, "Would all great Neptune's ocean wash these hands? No, rather would the multitudinous these hands would the multitudinous seas incarnadine, making the green one red." So it's massive and cosmic because you've got multitudinous and incarnadine, but then you get 4 one-syllable words: the green one red. That brings it home. I am here with this blood on my hands,
Yeah. To illustrate further what you just said there, in the Spanish language, it's estimated that there's twice as many words available to an English speaker than there is to a Spanish speaker.
Yeah.
However, they conjugate words so much more that they have about 3 times more available ways to use a word than we do.
Yeah.
And I see my son, for example, the word you just said, red, it's got that Germanic, it's blood red. It's so obvious. But he prefers to use the romanticized Spanish version, which is the rojo. It seems to express the color more than red.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's both available to him, and that's just a gift in itself. But as I say, to some degree, we have that even just. The other advantage, of course, of inflected languages like Spanish from a poet's point of view is in English, because we're not an inflected language, the word order has to do a lot of the work on making sense of which is the subject and which is the object and all of that. Whereas in Latin and the Latin-derived languages, the endings, the suffixes and prefixes are doing the grammatic heavy lifting. So you can then play with the order of the words in a completely creative way for different effects, and you can hold the verb till the end and then have it really ring through and make sense of all the rest of it.
Isn't this what they say about the German speaker? I have a German friend who comes here and we film, and my wife, Natalia, she said to me that the beauty of German when she hears it is because they hold that key to the very last word. So when you go out and have a dinner with German people, guess what they do that nobody here does? They listen. They're sitting listening actively, waiting for the end of sentences. Here, it's a race to cut in and cut off and take over. It's a stream of consciousness here, whereas Germans have a stream of listening, which I far prefer.
That's very true. But anyway, I think whatever we're really opening out the extraordinary mystery of speech itself, of language. The Anglo-Saxon, as you know, the Anglo-Saxons do lots of what, as do the Nordic peoples, of what they call kennings, right? So they won't call which is a kind of embedded metaphor. So they wouldn't call a spade if they could call it an earth biter.
Yes.
And you get, so the vocabulary for them is the word hoard. Like a dragon's a treasure hoard. But one of the there's a great Anglo-Saxon.
Could I quickly interject there, Malcolm? My grandfather from the north of Scotland used to say to me when I was a little fella, he said, "Why would you use 3 words when 7 all do?"
Oh, brilliant. My mother used to have 2 sayings to me about that, because she knew I could play with language. So she said, she would say these usually in sequence. She'd say, "You've the gift of the gab very galloping." And then she would add with a pointed finger, she said, "But your tongue will get you hung." Both of which are true in different ways. But anyway, to go back, there's an Anglo-Saxon poem called The Dream of the Rood. And it has a kenning for human beings, which is perfect, which is reodberend, which means word bearers. What makes us human is that we bear language. We bear it. It bears us. We also bear in the other sense that we reveal things through language. So I just feel that
never a man was hung for what he didn't say.
Yeah, exactly. But I think we've rather diminished the way we use language, as you yourself were saying. And I think the most the most potent and the most beautiful and literally enchanting mode of language is poetry, not of the modern chopped prose, disappearing up its own arse kind of intellectual university poetry, which is what's put people off poetry. But poetry in the old forms, the ballads, the rhyming couplets, I think that's an exalted mode of speech, which we've almost forgotten. And I'm attempting to revive it. So here's an interesting thing. I mean,
Wonderful.
when you're pitching a book to a publisher, well, actually nowadays, unfortunately, when you're pitching anything to anybody, they always say you have to have a so-called USP, i.e. the unique selling point. So I thought, well, I said to these publishers, look, the USP here is that nobody has done this on this scale in poetry for 150 years. But then I felt I had to add that in this case, the USP might be the unique sinking point, because there might be a reason why nobody's done it. But I had a hunch that if I could pull this off, it might be what we needed.
What do you see as a wasteland today that's in need of a Galahad?
That is the key question. Absolutely. So when my mother told me the Dolorous Stroke story and about the wasteland, and I was horrified that the Dolorous Stroke, the spear of Longinus, I said, Mum, how could there even be a world, where one person doing such a rash thing and all the fish dying and the cows can't calve? And I'm 8, and my mother says to me, I'm telling you this story because you need to know that you live in just such a world. This was 64, 65, just after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I realized we could cause a literal wasteland. But later on, when I came as an academic to realize just how deeply disenchanted we become, my whole academic life is about defending the imagination as a truth-bearing faculty, to say it's one of the ways we know what's real actually is paradoxically the imagination. So I began to see the wasteland then as this dull, deadening, mechanistic, it's just stuff interacting. So the wasteland version of what it is to be human is not to be a Raod Baron, and a speech bearer and a mythic hero, but to be a selfish gene, mindlessly self-replicating, an unwinding enzyme. That flattening and crushing, that refusal of all the other dimensions, and certainly including the spiritual one, is to make a wasteland. But here's the thing. The reason why we're making an actual wasteland, while we're literally polluting rivers, and there's a whole passage in my bio application, the reason why the soil is barren, the reason is precisely because we had this false view of the world in the first place. We lost the mutually courteous thing where there would be, where there were dryads in the trees and naiads in the streams, and there were spirits of the corn, and, John Barleycorn was a person, not a product, as soon as we lost that and turned it all into just inanimate stuff, that gave us the license and the excuse to actually start not only exploiting it, but trashing it. So this waste reductive mental view actually led to the genuine reductive wasting of the thing. So my poem in itself is trying to be a kind of Galahad and say, no, you got this wrong. You need to lift the veil of the surface. You need to understand the spiritual resonances of everything. You need to realize. So in my version of the story, the knights can't get through the wasteland to go to the castle without the help of the 3 trees, oak and ash and thorn. But the 3 trees can't do anything because they're almost dead. And they're by a stream where a naiad dwell. And what happens is Galahad has to sing an old ballad. Bors plays on that. And he has to woo the naiad who's retreated deep. So she will come back up and trust human beings maybe one last time. And then she washes the feet of the trees. And then the dryads of the trees come out and give to each of the 3 knights a gift, which enables them to get through the wasteland. And then, of course, when the Grail is achieved and the drops of blood from the spear that wounded him fall again into the wound of the Fisher King, and he is healed, then the wasteland is healed. But they can't do it without actually effectively apologizing to the land and the trees for what they've done, and then renewing a new courtesy with them. And I literally think that has to happen, and it is happening. If you think like Rob McFarlane's book, Is a River Alive? It's a question we should have asked a long time ago.
Can you come back on and we'll have another chat when the next installment of this series is released later this year?
Yeah, because we'll do that, because there might be, particularly in that, there's a couple. Well, I notice your interest in astronomy and in the relationship of astronomy and landscape, and there's a whole section in the next book where Merlin and Arthur turn into owls and then fly into a stargazing tower, and then Merlin shows Arthur the night sky and initiates him into this macrocosmos, microcosmos correspondence.
Let's get into astronomy within the Arthuriad at the end of the year, sometime towards August, September. I would love to do that. I've got so much to talk to you about that.
Great. Anyway, nice to meet you, and there's probably a bit of bailout too at this point. Thank you.
Thank you so much.